So in this Apple Motion and Final Cut Pro 10 tutorial, we're going to have a look at how we create a basic effect. So this is an effect that you can use in Final Cut Pro, but we're going to have a look at how you can actually make that effect from scratch in Motion with slider options and color boxes that you can select from to modify the effect in Final Cut Pro. And this is particularly useful for those who are looking at creating their own effects, their own transitions, their own generators in Final Cut Pro. So let's get started. So we're in Apple Motion and we have Final Cut Pro open as well, but we'll come to Final Cut Pro in a little bit. We're going to start straight away in Apple Motion, and what we're going to do is go ahead and make a new project. So when you come to File and New in Apple Motion, you're going to get a few different options here. So we've got options for a basic motion project, for a Final Cut Pro effect, which is what we're going to create here, and then for generators and transitions and titles and that type of thing. So we're going to grab an effect here. I'm working for the most part in my edits in broadcast HD and 29.97 frames per second, NTSC. So I'm going to leave those settings as is, and I'll leave the duration at the default of 20 seconds. It won't matter too much for the kind of effect that we're making here. So the next step is once we press open, we're then going to go ahead and save the effect. So when you're saving effects, you're effectively saving them into your motion projects folder that will show up in Final Cut Pro. So if we go to File and Save or Save As, then we're going to get an option here to create a new template. We can drop it into any of the custom folders or categories that we have in Final Cut Pro. We're going to save it into My Effects, but you may want to create a new category down here for your own effects. And then we're going to call this Blur and Tint. So we're going to create an effect that combines the blur effect and the tint effect that we can apply to any clip in Final Cut Pro, along with options to change the color of the tint, to change the amount of blur and that type of thing. So we'll hit Publish here. So now that we've saved this effect off, it will be visible in Final Cut Pro. So if we come to Final Cut Pro and come to the right hand side here to show our effects, we'll see a list of all the effects, and then we can see my category of Ben's effects, and we have this blur and tint effect here. Now it's not doing anything yet, we haven't applied any of those settings in Motion. But what we can do is we can keep working on it in Apple Motion, save it, see if it works, test it, and quite quickly flip between Final Cut Pro and Motion to test this as we're developing this effect. So we'll jump back into Apple Motion now. And essentially the way that this works is that we have an effect source, which would be the video that you were applying the effect to. The source will be the clip that you drag it down to in Final Cut Pro. So we're going to add the effects that we're going to use here. So we're going to come across to our library on the left hand side here in Apple Motion and come to Filters. And we're looking for the Gaussian blur. So we'll drag this down to the effect source. So we're applying that effect to this. And now we'll go ahead and look for the second effect we're going to add here, which is going to be the tint effect. Now we can search through these different options here, or we can come down to the little search button down at the bottom here and type in tint, and then find the tint filter in Apple Motion, and we'll pull this across to our effect source as well. And now that we've added those two effects, they will work in Final Cut Pro. So if we jump back to Final Cut Pro now, we'll see that when we have our playhead hovering over a clip and we come to our effects on the right hand side, when we hover over the blur and tint, it's going to tint it. But now we really just need to add in some options so that we can modify that effect in Final Cut Pro, because we don't have those options yet. It will be a fixed effect, i.e. we can't change anything. So we'll jump back into Apple Motion, and the first thing we'll do is add a slider for the blur. So to add a slider, the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is go to Object and New Rig. And the rig essentially allows us to add drop-down menus, sliders, and other options for effects that we want to control. So we'll select our rig, and we'll come across to the left-hand side and go to the inspector. And you'll see here that we have this option for the rig to add a new slider, which is what we'll do for the Gaussian blur. So we'll add a new slider, and then we can set for that Gaussian blur options for the slider when it's at its far left. So this button that's highlighted blue at the moment, and then we can modify how far the slider goes to the right. So once we've added a slider, we'll click on Start, and this is the rig recording mode. So now when we go to Gaussian blur and we set the amount of Gaussian blur down to 0, it's actually going to record in that rig. So if we go back to the slider in our rig now, which we can see in the project, and stop the rig record, you can see that the effect source, the Gaussian blur, is set to 0, and now when we slide this slider, it's sliding up and down, although very slowly. So we're going to click on the right hand side here, and we're going to slide that slider to the right. So we're clicking this blue button, and now we can actually set this to 100. So very blurred, and now you can see that once we set both of those on the left and on the right, when we slide the slider, the effect is going to change in conjunction with that. So there's one last step before that will actually work in Final Cut Pro, and that is to publish what we've done. So if we click here, we can now publish that slider and then go to File and Save. And now when we come back to Final Cut Pro, if we drag this blur and tint option across here, you can see it's blurred, but we have a slider that allows us to control that blur, so we can control the blur. Now effectively we've made a slight variation on the blur effect that's already in existence, but you can see the possibilities that open up when you actually get control over your own effects, because we can add our own text above this or other effects in conjunction with this, as we'll do with a tint now. So if we come back to Apple Motion, we're going to add under our rig, we'll add a new slider. And at the moment our sliders are called Slider and Slider 1. I'm going to call this one Blur Amount. I'll call this slider 1 Tint Amount. So we'll be able to control the tint or the amount of tint with this slider, so we can have a little bit more color in our image, or we can have a full tint color. So now with the tint amount selected, we're going to press Start on the edit mode again, and then we'll come to our tint. So we want our tint intensity when our slider is to the left to be 0, i.e. that there's no tint. And so if we go back to our tint amount now, you can see we set that left slider so the range is set to 0. And we've got options for the range as well, like what the range is for our final amount. So if we stop the rig edit mode, we'll click on the right hand blue button here, and we can see that the maximum amount of tint is 1. And before the tint slider will be visible in Final Cut Pro, we again need to come here, click and go to Publish, and then we'll save that. And now we have the ability to control the amount of tint. What we don't have here is the ability to control the color of the tint quite yet. So if we come to the tint option, we'll actually do this slightly differently. So if we come to our color and we come across the right hand side here, this little drop down arrow, we can publish properties for our effects directly in the effect itself. Now the advantage of using the rig is that you have a little bit more control over the naming of things, but for the color, we have to come in here to actually publish it. So we'll publish that and go to File and Save. And now if we come back to Final Cut Pro, what will happen is when you've applied an effect already, it will actually keep the previous version of that effect applied on the timeline. So we need to actually click here and delete the blur and tint effect from this clip, and then apply it again. And now you can see we have something called slider, which we'll change in a second, sliding the amount of blur. And then we have the tint amount, so the amount of tint, so we can drop this down. And then we also have our color picker, so we can change the tint that's being used and the blur that's being used. Now one nice thing about all of these effects is that we can keyframe them. So if we wanted to, for instance, keyframe the blur, so we might have our clip very blurred at the beginning, come ahead in time, and I've just clicked one of these little diamonds to add a keyframe, and then I can drop down the blur. We're now going to get some animation of that tint and blur. And we can also keyframe the tint as well, so we can cycle through different colors for our tint. So we could start with no red, add a keyframe, come forward, and then ramp the red up. So we change the color and the tint color over time. So now finally, we'll just go ahead and change the slider name here. So in order to do that, we need to come back to Motion, and we're changing the slider name for the blur amount. We need to click on this slider and unpublish it, and then click on it and publish it again. And once we save that now, we'll delete the blur and tint from this clip again. So I'm just highlighting the effect and using the delete or backspace key on the keyboard, and I can apply the blur and tint now, and you can see the blur amount is there. Now one thing we might want to do here is reorganize the order of our sliders. So for instance, we might want to have the blur at the top, then the tint, and then the color adjustments which come along with the tint. So we'll jump back in to Apple Motion now and have a look at how we can do that. So the order in which things by default go into your plugin is the order in which you publish them. So the last one will appear at the bottom, but we can reorganize that. And to do that, we come to the project. And then once we're in the project, we'll see these 4 tabs up at the top, we come to the project here, and it's here that we can see the published parameters, and we can just click and drag these around into the order that we want so that it makes sense for those that are adjusting the effect. And one thing that's also important here is the amount that we leave these values at is the amount they will appear in Final Cut Pro when we first add that effect. So if I leave this at 50% and leave the tint amount at 50% and change the color here to a different color, perhaps we'll go for a red or a magenta to make it really clear, then those will be the colors and the values that will appear when we jump back into Final Cut Pro. So if you have any questions about Apple Motion or Final Cut Pro, then please don't hesitate to leave a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.